think, our 11th Alyth Online Lecture of this strange period that we're living through together. And our lecturer today is actually one of the very first people who I emailed back in April when we were thinking about how to put this together. So I'm really delighted that Gordon is going to be speaking about St. Paul's Cathedral for us in a moment. Just to remind you of how this works. So Gordon, I think, will be using PowerPoint. So best to put it on speaker view, and then you'll have a little Gordon in the corner of the screen whilst he's screen sharing his PowerPoint and his pictures. Because we are over quite a few screens this evening, if you have questions during the presentation, the way that I need you to send them is to send them to me at josh@alyth.org.uk, and then when Gordon finishes, I'll be able to put your questions to him on your behalf. But we're across too many screens to do it informally this evening. It is with a huge amount of delight that I hand over to Gordon, who's going to speak for us about the dome at St. Paul's Cathedral.
Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. The rain is pounding down on the skylight of my study upstairs, but my son Daniel, who's a live sound engineer, has set me up with a professional microphone. So I hope you can hear me clearly. Well, in choosing a theme for discussion about one of our most famous buildings, a discussion that would have resonance with our present crisis and with the Alyth community, of which I'm a proud member, I thought I would look at how Sir Christopher Wren met the challenge of crowning St. Paul's with a dome that he'd been planning since before the Great Fire of London devastated the medieval cathedral in 1666. How the cathedral survived the Blitz of London 80 years ago in the Second World War, and in conclusion, how we value the building today. St. Paul's Cathedral is this country's single greatest work of architecture. I think there's little doubt about that. It is a church, but also a place of national celebration and commemoration. This raises the question of the role of architecture in fostering community spirit, and especially in places of worship. Just now, moving on to the first slide. The Dome of St. Paul's is the cathedral's landmark, known throughout the world and associated with Britain's endurance and survival in World War II. I show here the famous photograph of the cathedral amid smoke and flames on the night of the 29th of December, 1940, during the first massive bombing raid on London by the Luftwaffe, when Churchill is said to have given the command, "St. Paul's must be saved at all costs," recognizing as he did the historic symbolism of the cathedral embodied in its dome. We look up to the dome and admire it. I'll be coming back to this, by the way. We look up to the dome and admire it for the serenity of its profile and perfect balance of form. The stone lantern bearing up the ball and cross appears to be supported by the hemisphere of the dome below, although this is only of timber construction covered with lead. This dome is itself carried on a wider circular colonnade of 32 columns, but with every fourth bay infilled as a buttress in yellow Ketton limestone rather than grey Portland stone, to carry the weight of the dome downwards to the crossing arches, but also giving the colonnade a distinct rhythm in 4/4 time, as it were, and lending visual solidity to the dome. These infill bays are pleasing visually, and they reassure us that the dome will stand and endure. They are one of Wren's most inspired creations. This structural system with buttresses infilling every fourth bay can be appreciated in this aerial view of the cathedral, taken about 20 years ago. You can see how the buttress piers link with a supporting structure at the base of the dome. But you also see how the dome appears somehow detached from the building itself. the upper walls of which are mere screens, and how the west towers differed markedly in design from the dome. These west towers are Baroque in form, with pairs of columns projecting on the diagonals. And I show now a more general view of the cathedral. And then they have a diminishing sequence of convex and concave profiles above. Why is there such a mismatch between the west towers and the main dome? That's a question I'll be attempting to answer. The French and Italians have little time for St. Paul's Cathedral. It lacks the unity of great monuments like Jules Hardouin Mansart's Invalides Church in Paris, built for Louis XIV and now sheltering the tomb of Napoleon. One French visitor to St. Paul's in the early 19th century contemptuously likened the columns of the west towers of St. Paul's to bunches of candles. He found the interior of the building totally devoid of spiritual content and asked the gatekeeper, "Where is the church?" At that time, the cathedral was blackened with coal smoke inside and out, and smoke on the inside of the building obscured the view of the top of the internal dome. The drab internal appearance of the building and the cathedral's lack of religious mission prompted Charles Blomfield, Bishop of London from 1828 to 1856, to remark, "I never pass St. Paul's Cathedral without thinking how little it has done for Christianity." A remarkable statement, and I can't imagine Josh or any of the Alyth rabbis saying that as they approach Alyth Synagogue, but it's to do with what goes on inside the building rather than its external form. And that's a point for discussion. The comment is very telling, actually, in an historical context, because the bishop was referring mainly to the building itself. It did not seem to him to draw people spiritually or to enhance their allegiance to the religion it served. The reason was that the cathedral had become atrophied as a place of worship by the middle of the 19th century, as the crossing area beneath and around the dome had been filled with monuments to military heroes of the Napoleonic Wars, following the funeral of Admiral Lord Nelson in 1806. Worship was confined to the choir behind a screen at the east end of the cathedral. And just before we move on, I'd like you to admire this view of St. Paul's in May 1912 from the top of Cannon Street, where you see it in its smoke-blackened form. But it's one of those captivating early photographic views of London where the people are looking out at the camera, a very engaging photograph of the cathedral, I believe, one which also shows the West Towers in a diagonal view in their best, as it were, their best perspective. Well, why was the cathedral atrophied as a place of worship in the middle of the 19th century? This was largely because the main space inside the cathedral, the nave and the crossing, were simply public places of parade without any places of worship except a morning prayer chapel at the west end. The process of populating the entire cathedral as a place of worship began in the 1870s when the choir screen was dismantled and worship began to take place beneath the dome, and it's continued into the present century as the entire cathedral now functions as a place of worship, the most recent change being the repositioning of the original font at the west end of the cathedral. It was previously in the north transept. Well, another great funeral at St. Paul's in the 19th century cemented the cathedral's role as the supreme place of national commemoration and celebration. This view of the crossing at the funeral of the Duke of Wellington in November 1882 makes the point that what goes on inside a building affects our perception of its interior. And you might say it's arguably more important. But I pose this question, is the opposite also true? What role do landmark features like Wren's Dome have in cementing our allegiance to a religion, to a community, or to both? Well, my own answer to that question, and Wren has his explanation as well, but my own answer would be that the Dome of St. Paul's is more potent as a national symbol rather than a religious symbol, partly through its association with British history, and partly because its design strongly evokes classical antiquity while being inherently a thing of beauty. And I think this is an important point to stress. The Dome of St. Paul's is a thing of beauty. There's a telling comment in E.M. Forster's Howard's End, a novel I studied for A-level. The book was written in 1910. And I quote here from that book, showing you a view of the cathedral from the top of the building at Ludgate Circus. The heroine of the novel, Margaret Schlegel, went for a few moments into St. Paul's, whose dome stands out of the welter so bravely, as if preaching the gospel of form. The gospel of form, not the gospel of Christianity. The welter is the confusion of traffic, the jumbled mass of buildings and the smoke-filled sky of London. The gospel of form is the perfectly balanced massing and profile of Wren's dome, I would argue. But now let's turn to Wren himself. We see him here in a portrait of 1694, which hangs in the lobby of the Royal Society of London, and which is reproduced in Lisa Jardine's magnificent biography of Sir Christopher Wren. And I can't speak of her without my voice cracking a little, as she died a few years ago. Wren was a founding member of the Royal Society and president in the 1680s. And you see him here with the cathedral in the background, with an artist's impression of the building as Wren intended it at that time. And what you see is, sorry, I'll go back. What you see is a building different to the one that was eventually completed. A dome of 16 bays rather than 32, and west towers very different to those eventually built. And I'll explain how on earth Wren managed to change the design of the dome, on which construction began in 1696 so radically. Now, Wren, as you probably know, was a scientific prodigy, but as Lisa Jardine emphasizes in her book, he was the son of the Dean of Windsor and therefore closely connected with the royal family. And this helped him in his career considerably. And he was chiefly, however, by the early 1660s, he was renowned as a geometrician and therefore expert in structural matters. And it was in 1661 that he was consulted by King Charles II about structural problems in the tower of the old cathedral. And we move on to a view of the old cathedral with a view of a scheme proposed by Sir Christopher Wren shortly before the Great Fire of London. In 1633 to 42, the royal architect Inigo Jones had restored the nave and transepts of the old cathedral and added a great west portico, a classical portico modelled on examples at Rome and published in treaties at the time. Jones had begun repairing the tower, the central tower, which had lost its spire when struck by lightning in 1561. But work was halted at the outbreak of civil war. Wren, who had been a schoolboy at Westminster School when Inigo Jones was finishing the west portico, proposed a solution in May 1666, just 4 months before the Great Fire. His solution was to build a dome across the entire width of the crossing, that is, up to and including the buttresses that you see either side of that tower. And it would have risen to a vast height, in fact, to a height of 362 feet, just 3 feet short of the dome he eventually built. And like the completed dome, it would have had a drum of 32 bays. Wren must have been aware of the structural and practical problems in a design like this. For you can see that the dome in the section here on the left rests on very thin arches. And the outer dome would have been timber clad with a timber lantern and metal spire on top. In fact, a perfect lightning conductor. But Wren had fallen under the spell of contemporary French architecture, having visited Paris during the plague in London in the previous year, where he had seen a type of dome church unknown in England, a dome rising high over a crossing and built in 2 shells, as you see in Wren's example on the left. An inner one in masonry construction, and then an outer dome above it. And the outer dome lets light in to filter through to the internal lantern and down to the crossing, giving a sense of a space beyond, which is an important aspect of dome construction at this period. It's interesting that when recommending this dome over the crossing of St. Paul's to the building committee charged with the repair of the cathedral, he commented as follows on the design of the dome. He wrote that his cupola and lantern would have incomparable more grace in the remoter aspect than it is possible for the lean shaft of a steeple to afford. It's a purely aesthetic comment. Wren doesn't comment on the symbolic value or significance of the dome. He could have said it symbolizes the heavens above the worshippers. He comments on the aesthetics, which is significant, as we'll see. Wren's several schemes for rebuilding the cathedral culminated in a proposal approved by King Charles II in December 1672, after the devastation wrought by the Great Fire of London. And here you see a view showing by Wenceslas from the tower of what's now Southwark Cathedral, showing the City of London before and after the Great Fire. And before I come on to the great model, it's worth making this point that the Cathedral Church of St. Paul dominates its landscape in the way no other church in Britain does, not even Durham Cathedral. It completely, in the medieval period and up to the early 20th century, it completely dominated the landscape and the main arterial route from the city to Westminster, the River Thames. And it's this dominance, this overwhelming dominance, that Wren was seeking to perpetuate, to reconstruct, as it were, after the Great Fire. And his proposal to do so was this scheme, which King Charles approved in December 1672, the scheme known as the Great Model, Wren's Great Model scheme. And this model was exhibited at the Royal Academy of Arts at an exhibition in 1991. Now, members of the Alyth community were privileged to join me, members of the Alyth Ramblers, I should say, and their friends were privileged to join me on a tour of St. Paul's last June when I gave a lecture at the cathedral, and we saw Wren's Great Model, including the current president and the past president of the synagogue. But we didn't go inside the model, and you can't do that, although I have been in the past. The king ordered that a model of Wren's scheme should be built large enough for a man to walk through. Well, the model was finished in September 1674, but did not find favor with the clergy of the cathedral, who objected to the choir of the design being circular. That was their main objection. And they were also concerned that the choir, the most important part as far as they were concerned, could not be completed until the whole building had been completed. And there was also a feeling, well, though it's not stated, that the dome of the model was too much like the great Catholic Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome. Nevertheless, although this model was rejected, many features of the model found their way into the completed building. The dome of 32 bays, although without the infill bays. And then in the plan of the building, the fact that the entire public space of the cathedral, the entire space of the cathedral, except for the choir, is open to the public. Would have been a place of parade, public entrances separate from the ceremonial entrances. Again, emphasizing the importance of public access to the central dome space, a space crowned by a dome that would have been formed in coffering, decorated in mosaics, a form of decoration that recalls the first great dome of antiquity, the Pantheon in Rome, a building universally admired in the Renaissance period, and really the fons et origens, the fount of all subsequent domes. This dome would have risen over a central crossing space would essentially have been a public space of meeting and celebration, not a place of worship. And now we can just look briefly at the context of St. Paul's alongside other domes. And this is an illustration of comparative domes that I helped prepare for the National Geographic magazine. I was advising on St. Paul's Cathedral back in February 2014. And it takes us through from the dome of the Pantheon in Rome, which when it became a church, it introduced the dome as a form of covering for church architecture. An early example being Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and then the two great domes of the Italian Renaissance, to which all architects looked up to, Brunelleschi's dome of Florence Cathedral and Michelangelo's dome of St. Peter's Basilica, the largest of them all. But those two, built like the previous ones, entirely of masonry construction in either single or double shells of masonry, without a lower inner dome. And what strikes you when you look across at St. Paul's Cathedral is the thinness of the structure. And another important innovatory detail, the sloping inner drum of the dome, which I'll talk about in a moment. But before I do so, please notice on the right, the United States Capitol, one of many Capitol buildings in states in the United States that is inspired by St. Paul's Cathedral. It's a dome that has inspired great public buildings throughout the English-speaking world, not the French or Italian-speaking world, I hasten to add. Anyway, going in closer to this drawing and looking at the dome as built, you see this remarkable structural feature of Wren's dome, which is in fact an innovation of his, in that Wren has sloped the inner drum so that it serves partly as a wall and partly as a buttress, directing the weight of the stone lantern from above, which is carried on an internal cone made of brick. The brick cone rests on a common base with the inner dome here, and as we'll see, that is strengthened by rings of iron, which reduce the outward thrust from the inner dome and the middle dome, all of which support the crowning lantern. And the painted scheme of decoration is not one Wren approved of. The scheme of decoration on the internal cupola is by Sir James Thornhill, depicting acts in the life of the Apostle St. Paul. But notice how it marries with the architectural framework in that the 8 bays of arches which frame the grisaille paintings align with the buttresses, which in turn align below with the piers of the crossing. So you see in this section the brilliance of I say Jones, that's because I work on Inigo Jones as well, Wren's structural system, which directs the line of force directly down from the buttress pier to the 8 crossing piers. So how did Wren arrive at this solution? And why was he able to change his design late in the day? One of the most surprising aspects of the history of the design of the cathedral. To understand this, we must first understand how Wren designed the building stage by stage, for that is indeed what happened. Wren was able to keep his options open by using a contractual system for stonework that only committed him to parts of the plan and elevation at any one time. This drawing here is an adaptation I've made of a coloured up elevation and half plan that I published in an article in 2004 to show how Wren enlarged the plan westwards soon after James II's accession in 1685 to add a 2-storey western body and continuous screen walls along the upper part of the building. He was only able to do this with encouragement from the king after the king's new parliament tripled the cathedral's revenue from coal tax coming into London. Wren then added the upper screen walls in line with the western 2-storey western body to create a continuous 2-storey body beneath the dome. But then only in 1690, when construction was reaching the top of the crossing arches, did he return to the design of the dome from this level upwards. just go back to that that drawing just to look at this chronology. So here you see on the right hand side half the plan of the eastern arm, the choir, and part of the plan of the crossing and transepts. Those are coloured brown and green. All that work was begun in 1675. Then soon after, Wren began the nave, but didn't begin the west end until 1686 to 7. Everything in blue and red is from 1686 to 7 and postdates that big increase in money after the accession of James II. It was then, after revenues had increased, that Wren was able to revise the design and extend the west end from his originally planned 480 feet to something more like 525. But then, working with the same contractual system that allowed him to contract the building part by part, he then designed the lower part of the dome and then the upper part of the dome from 1702, following another change in circumstances at the accession of Queen Anne, and then finally the lantern, and at the same time, the western towers. So that's an outline of the chronology. And this is the effect of it, a quite astonishing effect. Difference you can see between Wren's crossing design in 1675 in a drawing here at All Souls College, drawn on a very complex drawing by Wren and his draftsman, a man named Woodruff, which shows the dome on the diagonal section. And this is an elevation and section which exactly fits the footprint of the foundations of the cathedral. And this is how high the dome would have reached at that. The inner dome would have reached, the outer one a bit higher. This is the completed dome, believe it or not. Wren radically increased the height of the dome, and we'll look at the structural context of that later. If you were making this kind of change to a building during construction today, you would certainly have to, as they say, put in for planning for the revised design. And no doubt, you would also have concerns about the structural viability of the new scheme. And this proved to be the case. And by the way, you wouldn't get planning permission. Anyway, how did Wren succeed in lightening the structure of his dome to carry the weight he intended? Well, the concept had its basis in mathematics, and Wren was a mathematician, in an idea proposed in 1670 by Wren's scientific colleague Robert Hooke in a demonstration to the Royal Society in London. Hooke argued that the catenary-shaped profile of an equally weighted chain, when inverted, gave the ideal structural form for a freestanding arch, and that the mathematics of those were of a graph y equals x squared, as you see here. But then in the following year, he devised another scheme for a three-dimensional standing form, a cubic parabola, where the mathematics are those of y equals x cubed. So 2 cubed is 8, 3 cubed is 27, 4 cubed is 64. Well, Wren in about 1690 came up with a proposal for a dome that allowed the weight of the upper structure to be transferred downwards on what he thought was an ideal profile. And in this drawing, annotated by his colleague Nicholas Hawksmoor, says Sir Christopher Wren's own hand, you can see he's drawing the profile of a cubic parabola for his dome, since 2 units are 8, 3 units are 27, and 4 are 64. So what are those units? They are 20-foot divisions of the crossing space, which is a vast 160 feet wide. So Wren is using mathematics to proportion his dome, but it's an ideal scheme that informed the eventual one. And here you see the crossing space in relation to the entire cathedral and the dome as it sits on that crossing space. And here you see the crossing area, which gives you a sense of where Wren was intending to build from. So in 1695, early 96, construction began at this level, if you can see my cursor, that level upwards. And the concept was one informed by the cubic parabola, but had to be significantly modified, since if you're carrying a lantern at the top, you have to have straight walls, not curved walls, to transfer the weight down. So this drawing by Wren's draftsman, William Dickinson, was actually prepared in several stages. It's a section through the crossing, showing that exactly that area we saw before. Here's the crossing, 1, 2, 3 arches. And here you see the crossing here and the structure rising above it. But this is a drawing showing the design evolving in stages. On the right side, we can date this to 1701. On the left side, 1702 to 3. And at the base, you see where work began in 1696 with the sloping inner wall, that crucial structural innovation. And then, as I mentioned, iron chains around the base of the shared base of the inner dome and the brick cone to contain the stress and direct it downwards onto the fronts of the crossing piers, and another slot for an iron chain there. So a brilliant structural solution. And here we see it alongside an engraving of 1702 showing the design of the dome and the cathedral and the western towers at that time by Simon Gribelin. Quite remarkable, the year of Queen Anne's accession, and the dome and west towers changed remarkably after this date. Now, I learned at a Ulpan class with Nietzsche Spiro that the Hebrew word, the Ivrit word for dome is kippah. Kippah. I don't think that's really appropriate for Wren's dome, but I feel the kippot, the kippah, is appropriate for the domes he had in mind for the West Towers, which are not all that elegant. But how and why did Wren change the dome in this way? Well, let's look now at the difference between what was proposed in 1702 and what was built by 1710. A striking modification in a few years of design and construction. And how and why did Wren do this? And this tells us something about how the dome relates to the Western Towers and relates to the townscape. Well, the principal reason must be, and can be proved to be, that Wren knew that his building would be approached on the diagonal, or on a slight diagonal, up Ludgate Hill. It had to be seen prominently and attractively in this diagonal approach. And the Western Towers, with their jutting pairs of columns, so contemptuously called bunches of candles by that French commentator, address the diagonal axis. And they also provide a dramatic contrast with the solid geometry of Wren's dome. And this is one of Wren's triumphs as an architect, and one of the great achievements of any British architect, and one of the reasons why the cathedral is so loved and so respected. And the fact that Wren thought in this way is demonstrated by this northwest prospect of the cathedral in an engraving by Robert Trevitt in 1710, where for the first time, Wren presents the building in perspective and on that diagonal view. In fact, this elevation shows beneath the west window a door which had disappeared by the end of 1710. And that door was for people to go out onto the upper portico to see processions arriving at the cathedral from Westminster. And that's the great beauty of the approach up Ludgate Hill, and nowhere more movingly commemorated or illustrated than at the wedding of, in these photographs of the wedding of the Prince and Princess of Wales at St. Paul's Cathedral in 1981, where you see the couple about to leave the cathedral with the west doors open. And anyone who's been in the cathedral for a great ceremony of commemoration, I think Josh may have been, when the west doors open, it's a very exciting moment for people inside the cathedral. There's a feeling of the street entering the cathedral. But it's also an exciting moment for those outside as people emerge, as the main participants emerge from the cathedral, and what they've done becomes part of the public life of the community. And Wren's design responds masterfully to this particular situation. But he didn't achieve this without a struggle. In 1697, I begin with 1696, there was a landslide at the island of Portland, where the Portland stone came from. And this was the year when the famous relief was carved in the south pediment of the cathedral with a phoenix rising from the ashes above a tablet carved with the word resurgam, I shall rise again. That was in 1696. Then in 1697, the cathedral's funding was cut by half, and Wren had to consider what he should do. Should they stop work and pay off the debts, or should they carry on? Wren decided to carry on, just confining his work to the west, to the dome. And his comments are interesting on his reasons. He says, but still it may be considered whether it be not expedient to humour the expectation of the world and use the present income to complete the dome and save much scaffolding. If this method be followed, the debts must lie upon the 16 years to come, and the difference will be paying interest somewhat longer. So he stopped work at the West End, concentrated on the dome, but in a reduced way. But his key point was, we have to carry on. We cannot stop. That would gravely harm the reputation of the cathedral. And that was very good advice. But in doing so, Wren hastened on and probably cut corners, because the design that he eventually built, the design that was eventually built, had within it inherent structural problems. And this was the subject of the lecture I gave at St. Paul's Cathedral last year, where our Alyth Ramblers friends were present, and some of you may have heard me talk about this. I'll just pass over it briefly again. By the early 20th century, the cathedral's surveyors were increasingly concerned about the amount of settlement in the cathedral. Wren had, by building the lantern at the top of the dome, had brought excessive weight down on the the fronts of the crossing piers, causing the inner drum of the dome to separate from the outer drum and fracturing in the radial arches that connect the inner drum to the outer colonnade. You can see the slippage there. I should say this is nothing like the structural failure of the Dome of St. Peter's in Rome in the 17th century, which was repaired in the 18th century. And in fact, in all probability, the building had settled to a new stasis or a new state. But nonetheless, precautions were taken, precautions that were valuable for the future of the cathedral. The damage was repaired, and a massive program of structural repairs around the crossing in the late 1920s, involving grouting, steel pins, and then a belt and braces reinforcement of the dome, the two drums of the dome, connecting them together and binding them with a ring of concrete, ensured the dome's stability. In fact, the cathedral had been given served with a dangerous structures notice by the Corporation of London in 1924. And the notice stated that they should take down the dome and rebuild it in such a manner as to render it safe. It was this dangerous structures notice that prompted this massive campaign of restoration, because it soon hit the press, and newspapers like the Daily Mirror, believe it or not, ran campaigns to raise money across the empire. And within a few months, at least £200,000 had been raised to pay for the money. That's an indication of the esteem in which Wren St. Paul's was held at that time. But it was an esteem which served the cathedral well. And now I come back to the Second World War and that night of the 29th of December, 1940. And when I was working on my catalogue, it's on the cathedral's website now, catalogue of Wren's designs for St. Paul's in the archive of St. Paul's Cathedral, on the shelf next to where I was sitting was the diary of St. Paul's Watch. And I opened it to the page 29th of December 1940, and it's filled with a list of bombs that fell on the cathedral. 24 incendiary bombs recorded fell on the cathedral, says the logbook, and it lists the bombs. But what's interesting when you look at the text is that these were incendiary bombs. They were lightweight incendiary bombs that didn't pose a grave threat. So one penetrated the flat roof over the trophy room, extinguished with stirrup pumps. 3 more fell under the south portico and were all swept away with a strong jet of hydrant water. Well, that was in December 1940, but in the following April, a 500-pound bomb exploded mid-air in the north transept, crashing into the crypt, shaking the south transept. Now, had the cathedral not been repaired in the 1920s, it could have collapsed. So although Churchill may have pronounced St. Paul's must be saved at all costs, what matters was the foresight of people looking after the building, planning ahead and securing it, and the loyalty of St. Paul's Watch, who were on duty continuously. And you may be interested to know that when St. Paul's Watch was disbanded, they became the Friends of St. Paul's Cathedral. And that was the first Friends organization of any kind in this country. And now we have Friends organizations everywhere. So St. Paul's Watch became the model for something we have today that preserves our institutions and historic buildings. But now I want to finally look briefly at the setting of the cathedral. How in danger is that setting? Well, I can reassure you on this, and I can only spend a few minutes on this, but there's plenty in the press about horrendous modern buildings rising up in the city, and they are indeed horrendous, or some are more elegant than others. But there are several crucial strategies in place that protect the cathedral, one of which is what is known as St. Paul's Heights. You may be aware of this. St. Paul's Heights controls were introduced after two buildings, the Unilever building and a telephone exchange, were built to the south and west of the cathedral, rising up to block views. Immediately, the Corporation of London drew up a plan of heights that had to be respected, come what may. Nothing could go over those heights. And those heights, St. Paul's Heights, still apply today. And in my job at English Heritage, when I was a historic building inspector, I had to give lots of advice on development in the City of London, and often came up against the chief planning officer. And one of his favorite sayings was, in planning, there is no such thing as a half-open door. He would not contemplate any single break above the St. Paul's Heights controls. And this is the result of the St. Paul's Heights controls when you look eastwards towards what's called the Eastern Cluster. This was taken in 2014. The flatness, the flat church, the flat roofs beneath you. And even the buildings in the backdrop defer to the cathedral. This is a building where initially they proposed, British Land proposed, or another developer proposed a tubular tower, but they were obliged after pressure from English Heritage and the corporation to slope the side of the building to defer to views of the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral from Fleet Street. That is the only reason why that building slopes. And now there are imitations of this building around London. There's one near Shepherd's Bush. It's like a child of St. Paul's, but there's no St. Paul's to protect. Well, finally, looking at the view of St. Paul's from Waterloo Bridge, we see how it's evolved over the years. And there we see on the left, the Prince of Wales with the cathedral on the cover of his book. He's almost about to reach out and grab it to protect it. But it is to some extent protected by the St. Paul's Heights controls and by other controls, the most significant of which in terms of property values are the 8 protected vistas of the cathedral, the longest of which is from King Henry VIII's Mound in Richmond Park, 11 miles away. And this view of the dome, you may have seen it, you almost need binoculars to see it. It's in the gap of a hedge, but it prevents any development in this entire corridor here and any development behind. And if you look at the backdrop there, you'll see there's a gap between the northern cluster and the eastern cluster as a result of the setting, of protecting the setting of St. Paul's Cathedral. Well, I come to my final slide, and I reflect on the fact, firstly, that the overall result of these protections, these layers of protection, is that St. Paul's Cathedral is by a long way the world's most expensive building, for it freezes hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds of real estate value. But recent cleaning of the building, shown in this photograph, and the regeneration of Paternoster Square alongside, and its setting within the St. Paul's Heights area has made it a far more welcoming place, far more open and inclusive to worshippers of all kinds, and especially the young who go to this cathedral rather than to churches. And it's no longer an exclusively male establishment. As we know, it has a female bishop, Sarah Mullally, and also a female chancellor whom we met last year when I gave my lecture, Paula Gooder, who is responsible for the Cathedral's theology learning program. Well, the vibrancy of the contemporary cathedral, I would say, cannot be disassociated from the quality of the building as a work of architecture and its state of preservation. Having one without the other, I would argue, is not possible, and a fine work of architecture without a living and vibrant community is vacuous. Well, I conclude with the opening sentence of Wren's first tract on architecture, a manuscript completed in about 1710 when the cathedral was completed and published by his grandson in 1750. Nowhere does Wren write about religious symbolism in architecture, but he writes about the role of public buildings for the well-being of society. And in his day, churches and cathedrals were in this category. No church was more public than St. Paul's Cathedral. And he was surely right when he wrote that such architecture draws people and commerce, and makes people love their native country. A passion, he says, which is the original of all great actions in a commonwealth. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your attention.
Gordon, thank you. That's a really extraordinary lecture. I think so much in that 45 minutes. Should we just stop the screen share so that people can see you and me and more broadly?
Stop screen share. Yeah.
There you go. So I like to think that I know a little about a lot. So for most of these lectures, I've been able to hold my own in a sort of 10-minute conversation afterwards. I'm not sure how well I'm going to go on architecture as it happens, but I can talk about religion. And what was interesting to me was that observation at the end that actually this was more feels like it was more a national endeavor than a religious endeavor. I mean, was any thought given to kind of its religious significance and also to the experience of prayer that would be created from the inside, or was it really a statement of architecture and also a statement of national pride for Wren?
Well, the only comments we have about the religious purpose of the building are right at the beginning of the process, when the great model is rejected and the clergy ask for something, they say, more of a cathedral fashion. They want something more traditional, but they don't comment on religious worship per se. These are things that were completely taken for granted. And in fact, when Wren talks of the nation, he's talking of the nation as a Christian nation. So public buildings, the nation and the church are one and the same things. The religious function of the cathedral was something that had been established centuries before. So there's little comment on it other than saying we need this, we need a morning prayer chapel. We need a consistory court, which is a religious court. There is no comment in the minutes and the contemporary minutes and discussion about the religious purpose of the building. It's only later when the building's finished that critics, especially foreign critics, complain about the lack of religiosity in the architecture, especially the French and the Italians, who, when they go into great dome churches, expect the nave and the transepts to be filled with chapels and decoration, taking them on a journey from the west end to the east end, to the high altar at the east end. What we find, I say just briefly, what we find when looking at contemporary comments is how little is said in the minutes of the building commission and the building committee. Very little is said, almost nothing is said about design. It's all about process, money, and this, that, and the other, and also very brief. So we're rather at a loss on the perception of the cathedral and the church, or a great cathedral like St. Paul's in the later 17th century. We only have adverse comments in the 18th and early 19th century. And then this great move in the mid-19th century to revitalize the cathedral. It's then that the religious commentators really get to work.
I mean, I've had the privilege, as you know, of being in a service sat right underneath the dome.
Yeah.
I had the privilege of being at the installation of the Bishop of London, Sarah Mullally.
Oh, yes.
And was very struck by in the ceremony itself by the extraordinary meeting of the church with the power of the city and the power of the monarchy.
Yes.
And I think you don't really get really understand the role that the church played, that equation of church with state, unless you've encountered something like that. But it feels like that's really one of the themes of your talk.
Yes, in fact,
Is
there's a
the
slide
extent to
that
which it's there.
yes, there's a slide that I left out because I was worried about how much I had, but it's a plan of the cathedral when it's completed, showing the north transept as the main access for the mayor and the aldermen of the City of London. And when you're at a state occasion at St. Paul's, the north transept, which faces is towards Cheapside and was in the medieval times always the entrance to the cathedral from the City of London. The north transept is used by the Lord Mayor, also used by the Prime Minister and government ministers. And the Lord Mayor's vestry is in the northwest angle, and then the Lord Mayor has his own stall in the centre of the choir. So yes, it's deep. The cathedral is deeply integrated with the City of London. I think this is one of the reasons why the City of London takes the St. Paul's Heights so seriously, and to their credit, they will not let anything above that threshold. So, you know, they are deeply connected with the cathedral, and that's very reassuring, I think. But that's one of the glories of the cathedral and what makes it a great public building, because it serves the wider mercantile community as well as the faith communities.
Right. And is that also part of the explanation for the absence of religious symbolisms, that actually it's kind of almost more sort of down and dirty, part of the city in which it lives, rather than trying to be, you know, a heavenly space, a highfalutin space somehow?
Well, yes, I mean, there is some interesting religious symbolism. In fact, if you walk around the outside of the cathedral, you'll find carved relief panels by Grinling Gibbons beneath all the windows, and they are full of religious motifs, such as the pelican pecking its breast so that it can feed the young with its blood. And then over the north transept, you have a wonderful relief of the arms of the City of London held up by two angels. The royal coat of arms held up by two angels. And that's the entry. The north transept is the entry for government ministers. So there is some religious symbolism around the outside, but on the inside of the building, you're quite right. As Wren designed it, there was very little. But then in the mid-19th century, it was decided that the cathedral was devoid of religious symbolism. It had to be, as it were, recharged visually. And that's when these mosaics were added around the dome. Mosaics covered the vault of the choir, and the cathedral took on an aspect which Wren would not have recognized. Wren designed a plain building without any carved relief ornament of direct religious symbolism in the main space of the cathedral. It was only in the choir where religious symbolism in the wooden carvings came into its own.
And would he have approved? What would he think of St. Paul's Cathedral now as it is experienced now, do you think?
I think he would have welcomed the way in which the choir of the cathedral is opened up to the whole vista of the interior, which certainly does make it a dynamic space and experience for visitors. So right from the entry at the West End, you feel you are in a religious space, and your welcome at the West End is a very warm one. The dome is a focus for worship, also used for concerts, but doesn't work effectively as acoustically. So I think he would have welcomed the extension of religious worship, religious community to the West End of the cathedral. He certainly would not have approved of the mosaics that were put on the vault of the choir of the cathedral in the early 20th century by an artist called William Richmond. I mean, they are absolutely appalling. They completely obscure the architectural form of the vaulting over the choir.
Right. So we've spoken a little about sort of church and monarchy and city. Of course, the other dynamic that's interesting is the tension within the church itself. So I was very struck when I attended the installation of the Bishop of London that the first thing that she had to do was pledge her loyalty to the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yes.
And is there, you know, we've spoken about St. Paul's as being the symbolic building, the national treasure. Has there been a tension with other cathedrals? How's that relationship been over the years?
Well, there hasn't been much of a tension as far as I'm aware. I mean, the St. Paul's Cathedral has stepped in for the See of Canterbury in that its consistory court also embraced the See of Canterbury. The only real tension was actually in the reign of Charles I, when the old cathedral was being restored. and the king was appealing for money across the country, and some dioceses were not happy, and there was a difficult relationship between the then Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, who had been Bishop of London, and the rest of the country. So William Laud, who spearheaded the restoration of the old cathedral in the 1630s, was a high church Anglican, and he imposed a form of worship on the cathedral and on other churches, which didn't find favour in Puritan parts of the country. And that period was one where the cathedral was most at odds with the community it served. And then things got much worse in the Civil War, when the cathedral was taken over by Presbyterian forces, and there was choir stalls were burnt, and a sort of chapel was set up in the old choir, which just had a table in the middle for an altar. And that reflects actually what happened to the cathedral in the Civil War, reflects the fact that the City of London has always been on the Puritan side in terms of its religious allegiance. There was always tension between the City of London and the Crown. So the City of London was strongly parliamentarian. And that tension has kind of worked its way through history. So when King Charles II approved Wren's Great Model, it did not find favour, partly because it was too Catholic. And so that again reflects that tension between the City of London and the court. I think that's a tension that is an exciting one in a way. You know, you've got two cities here, the City of London, the City of Westminster. They're joined by a ceremonial route, the Strand and Fleet Street. The destination is St. Paul's Cathedral, where they meet. So, you know, it's like the whole nation comes together in the building.
Right. I suppose one of the reasons I ask is because, of course, buildings are also statements of power. Yes. And so it's always been interesting to me that is the preeminent building. Yes. That kind of that therefore makes a statement about where power really lies.
Yes.
And kind of, you know, there didn't follow an attempt to, you know, redesign cathedrals in order to compete somehow.
No, it always maintained its preeminence. But when there were no great rebuildings of cathedrals after the medieval period, except until the 20th century, when you have cathedrals like Guildford Cathedral, and one or two others, Portsmouth Cathedral is another example. But these are relatively minor cathedrals. So yes, it was the Great Fire of London that was the catalyst for this great masterpiece of architecture, and the cathedral and the state found the perfect exponent in Sir Christopher Wren.
So you began by saying that it is the finest architecture in the country.
Yes, I think I'd hold by that.
What competes, in your opinion, as an architectural historian?
Well, I suppose Durham Cathedral competes. I mean, that's an extraordinary building and that's also a building of mainly one period. The remarkable thing about St. Paul's is it's the work of one architect of one period, whereas other cathedrals, Exeter Cathedral, Wells Cathedral, they have their wonderful elements, but they're not as unified. You might say Salisbury Cathedral is perhaps the most unified of all medieval cathedrals and must be fairly near the top. As regards public buildings, great public buildings, you know, I'm thinking actually of Greenwich Royal Hospital, which was designed by Wren and by Hawksmoor. But if coming to the 20th century, we do have great buildings. We have the National Theatre, Dennis Lassen's National Theatre, which is a masterpiece, and others like it. So I'm not averse to modern architecture, but I think this St. Paul's literally stands head and shoulders above the others.
Right. And of course, and Westminster Abbey. I mean, where does Westminster Abbey stand in terms of both its architectural standing, but also in relationship to St. Paul's? Because that's another kind of interesting set of relationships.
Well, I'm privileged to be working at the moment, writing a catalogue of Wren office drawings and Nicholas Hawksmoor drawings at Westminster Abbey. So I've had access to the Abbey. I've published on Wren's work at Westminster Abbey. And yes, I mean, there's a saying, robbing Peter to pay Paul. St. Peter is St. Peter's Westminster. Paul is St. Paul's Cathedral. There's always been a tension in terms of money and resources, but the Westminster Abbey is what's called a royal peculiar. It's the Queen's church. it's exclusive to the Queen. The ceremonies that take place in the choir of Westminster Abbey, coronation ceremonies, are exclusive. The choir of Westminster Abbey runs from the eastern arm across the crossing and into the nave. So the crossing space is a separate religious space. In the middle of that space is where the coronation takes place. But it's a heightened experience that's remote from the people around it. So Westminster Abbey has this very strong royal connection, but it lacks this wider connection with the public and the community at large by virtue of its design and its function.
We are nearly at time. So one of the wonderful things about these lectures has been sort of getting an insight into members of Alyth who we know have expertise, but just learn this little bit about. One last question. How did this come to be your love? What was the thing that drove you? What first attracted you and took you into this field?
Well, architectural history, because I was drawn to, I studied architectural history for A-level art. In those days, you could study architectural history as part of A-level art. And I became fascinated by Inigo Jones and Christopher Wren, and I marked up a plan of London. I didn't live in London, with buildings I wanted to visit. And they included St. Paul's Cathedral and the city churches, and the Soane Museum, and Westminster Abbey. And these are all institutions I've worked for since. But I came to St. Paul's Cathedral through my work on Inigo Jones. I did my PhD on Inigo Jones's architectural drawings, and Jones was involved in a major restoration of the cathedral in the 1630s. And from then I moved on to Wren. The building just, it kind of takes hold of you. It is, you know, such a fascinating building. I'm privileged to have been involved with, and I worked there, you know, worked in the archive in the building itself for 2.5 years. I had access to the entire building, so I could learn to understand it that way.
Wow. Real sort of dream fulfillment. Amazing.
Yes.
Great.
But quite hard, quite difficult to give a lecture on, I have to say, you know, but still I enjoy giving lectures. So
thank you. Gordon, thank you so much. I'm really incredibly grateful for your insights and your wisdom this evening. We're going to keep doing these for another few weeks, and then we're going to have a little break in August from the lectures. So next week, I'm really delighted that Professor Margaret Harris, another one of our own, is going to be speaking about the future of civil society and charities in the COVID-19 era. One of the delights of this series has just been the breadth of expertise and wisdom in our community. So I'm really delighted that Margaret is going to be sharing her knowledge with us. And you can see some of our previous lectures via YouTube. So this lecture is going to be available on YouTube from when we finish. And many of our former, the 10 previous lectures are also available. We weren't able to record all of them. There were some of our lecturers who unfortunately couldn't give us permission. And there are a couple where Adam forgot to press record. But there are some there, including, I just need to recommend last week's lecture, which was when it was incredibly warm out. And I think people were enjoying the sun. But Professor Shani Orgad on gender roles, both in business and also in the home, really an extraordinary hour and definitely worth watching. And if you haven't seen Hugh Selsick's hour on how to sleep better, genuinely has helped people in our community to have better nights of sleep. And that quite a few of them are on there. Everyone, I wish you a good evening. Thank you for being with us, and we will see you soon. And Gordon, thank you once again.
Okay, thank you very much.